Thank you very much. My name is Justine Marshall. I'm the manager of the London Centre for NTD Research, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our workshop 1.5, Strengthening the Connection Between Research and Programming to Beat NTDs. I'm going to read some housekeeping notes and then hand over to our director, Professor Sir Roy Anderson. So, housekeeping. You will notice you've entered the workshop with your cameras off and audio muted. Please keep your audio muted to help keep background noise to a minimum. If you're invited to speak, please unmute yourself by pressing the microphone button in the bottom left-hand corner, and feel free to switch on your video again by using the button in the left-hand corner. During this session, we'll be doing some work in group breakout rooms. When it's time, you will be automatically moved into a breakout group by one of the MYT team, and no action is required by you. Once you're in your breakout room, please turn on your video using the button in the left-hand corner. You may also unmute yourself when you wish to speak and participate. Kindly mute yourself again after you've spoken to avoid any background noise. Once the group work is completed, you will return automatically to the main room after a 60-second warning. Please take note of your facilitator's name when you move into your breakout room. Should you become disconnected at any point, we can use this information to add you back into the correct breakout room. We ask you then to switch off your video and audio again when you come back into the main room. If you wish to interact during the session, which I encourage you to do, please use the chat facility in the virtual meeting platform. You'll find this by going to the Agenda tab in the virtual platform and clicking on your session, which you should have already accessed to reach this workshop. Hopefully you've seen the email that was sent out on Monday detailing how to communicate during the workshops with the chat facility. So you can view both the chat and the presentation. Please email the team if you're having difficulties using the chat facility, and they'll be able to help you. And finally, the MYT team are here to help you with any technical difficulties. So please use the chat facility on the virtual meeting platform to technical questions or email the team. And I'm going to hand over now to Professor Sir Roy Anderson.
Right, thank you, Justine, very much. And thank you to NNN and Claire at MYT for all their help in setting this up. The London Centre for Neglected Tropical Disease Research is a collaboration between London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Imperial College London, the Natural History Museum, the Royal Veterinary College, and the Sanger Centre at Cambridge. And its objective primarily is to promote research for better understanding of how best to control tropical diseases, and particularly the NTDs. Now, in terms of the topic of this particular session, the days are long gone where opinion dominated.
Roy, you appear to be on mute. Can you mute?
Right, my apologies for that. First of all, welcome and thank you very much indeed. The London Centre is a collaboration between the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Natural History Museum, Imperial College London, the Sanger Centre at Cambridge, and the Royal Veterinary College in London. Our objective is to promote research to better understand how to control infectious diseases. The days are long gone where opinion dominated in terms of what control options should be implemented. We are in a world which is very much evidence-based. That can be either based on clinical trial information or indeed on calculations. It's worth reminding ourselves about how research feeds into the design of control programs. As a young man, I was very much struck by one Nobel Prize winner who was advising the British Prime Minister on what was basic research. And he said to the Prime Minister, there are two sorts of research, basic research and not yet applied research. And in essence, you can think about this in terms of the development of methods for looking at NTDs in a more precise way. And for example, if you take the polymerase chain reaction, which was invented some 35 years ago in 1985, and yet it's probably 30 years duration before it was implemented widely in diagnostics for NTDs. So bear that in mind. It often takes a long time from basic discovery to get through into practice. Now, what we're going to hear today, though, is a set of 4 talks which illustrate how research understanding improves both the implementation of programs, diagnostics, and treatment. And it's my great pleasure to ask Carolyn Vegbari from Imperial College London to start us off, who's going to talk to us about what are the advantages of treating women in antenatal settings to actually control soil transmitted helminths. So I'll now hand over to Carolyn.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, great. So thank you for listening to my talk, Can Deworming at Prenatal Clinics Prevent Morbidity from Infections with Soil-Transmitted helminths in Women of Reproductive Age? I give this talk on behalf of the NTD Modeling Consortium STH Group. Next slide, please. Here is a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, a general introduction to STH epidemiology and morbidity, then the WHO 2030 goals for STH. I will introduce our research question, which is also the title of this talk. And then I will talk about how we answered the question and what we found. Next slide, please. So worldwide, 1.5 billion people are infected with STH. Morbidity caused by STH is associated with moderate to high heavy intensity infections. Morbidity manifests as diarrhea, abdominal pain, malnutrition, physical weakness, impaired growth and development, and hookworm in particular is known to cause anemia, which can lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes and impaired lactation. In this talk, we will give an example of how we can strengthen the connection between research and programming to beat STH as an example of NTDs. Next slide, please. The WHO 2030 goals for STH include 2 main targets. First, the elimination of STH-related morbidity in preschool-age children and school-age children. And second, the establishment of an efficient STH control program in adolescent girls, pregnant women, and lactating women. The treatment strategy so far focused on deworming preschool-age children and school-age children with annual school-based mass drug administration in moderate prevalence settings and school-based treatment twice per year in high prevalence settings. The new treatment strategy will additionally emphasize treatment of women of reproductive age at times when they would normally come into contact with healthcare settings, namely during HPV vaccination in adolescent girls and at prenatal and maternity clinics for pregnant and lactating women. Next slide, please. So our research question is, can deworming during HPV vaccination and at prenatal and maternity clinics prevent morbidity from STH in women of reproductive age? We look specifically at hookworm because of its association with anemia, but general considerations hold for other STH species. Next slide, please. To answer this question, we designed the following quantitative study. We developed a cohort model following girls and later women from birth to age 70, and we apply an external and realistic force of infection to this cohort of girls and women that was derived from 2 independently developed stochastic individual-based models of hookworm infection and treatment. We used forces of infection from 2 different models because the models make different assumptions on the age intensity profile of infection and on the density-dependent fecundity of female worms, and this can have an effect on the predicted outcomes. We measured morbidity as the prevalence of moderate to heavy intensity infections in the cohort, and we look at 3 different treatment scenarios. First, we look at moderate prevalence settings with annual school-based deworming, and we compare the new treatment guidelines that includes treatment of women of reproductive age with the old treatment guidelines that was school-based only. Second, we look at moderate prevalence settings with treatment twice per year, And again, we compare the new and old guidelines. And thirdly, we look at high prevalence settings, again with treatment twice per year, and we compare the new and old treatment recommendations. For all three scenarios, we assume a treatment coverage of 75% and random compliance to treatment. Next slide, please. So here are the results for the moderate settings and annual treatment. On the left, you see the results with the force of infection from Model 1 developed by Imperial College London, which assumes a uniform age intensity profile of infection. On the right, you see the results with the force of infection derived from Model 2 developed by Erasmus MC in Rotterdam, which assumes a greater intensity of infection in adults than in children. On the x-axis, you see the age of the girls and women in the cohort, and the y-axis shows the prevalence of women with moderate to high intensity infections. The different colors indicate the different treatment strategies, and the result is that the scenario where moderate and heavy intensity infections of hookworm do not go extinct over time, the treatment of women of reproductive age leads to a small but significant reduction in moderate to heavy intensity infections. The results are similar for moderate prevalent settings and treatment twice per year, which is why I skip those and go directly to heavy intensity settings. Next slide, please. And here the figures have the same makeup. And you can see that hookworm infection persists over the entire lifespan of the cohort of women in both models. And both models agree that treatment of women of reproductive age leads to a reduction of moderate to heavy intensity infections and hence morbidity, but the impact is bigger in the Erasmus MC model on the right. Next slide, please. And so now, why are there these differences in the model predictions? There are three main reasons. First is the age intensity profile that I already mentioned. The Imperial College model assumes a uniform age intensity profile, and as a result, the impact of school-based deworming is stronger. So over a decade, in moderate prevalence settings, moderate to high intensity hookworm infections in adult women go extinct. Then second, there's density-dependent fecundity of female worms. This means how much does within-host competition impact on the number of eggs per female worms. And here the Imperial College model assumes exponential saturation, whereas the Erasmus MC model assumes hyperbolic saturation. Without going into mathematical details, the effect is that treatment has a bigger impact in the Erasmus MC model in high prevalence setting, which is what we have seen in the results. So the third point is the distribution of worm lifespans, which is exponential in the Imperial College model and Weibull distributed in the Erasmus MC model. And the result is that the worm population is more robust to extinction in the Erasmus MC model. Next slide, please. To summarize our conclusions, deworming of women of reproductive age during HPV vaccination and at prenatal and maternity clinics can reduce STH-related morbidity over the reproductive lifespan by, on average, 20%. So it does not completely prevent morbidity, but it has a significant effect. And this effect can be achieved in current healthcare settings, even in low-income countries, at little or no additional cost. And our qualitative or quantitative analysis shows how research can improve programming for STH and integration of healthcare components. Next slide, please. These are my acknowledgements, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Carolyn, very much indeed. Very precise. Now, what we're going to do here is, if there's any, we're going to move straight through the talks, and then in the discussion session, you're going to raise particular questions. So I'm now going to move on to Anna Phillips from the London Centre, who's going to talk about different strategies for deworming for the control of schistosomiasis. Anna, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about evaluating the impact of biannual or annual school-based or community-wide treatment on urogenital schistosomiasis in Niger. Next slide, please. So human schistosomiasis is a chronic water-associated parasitic disease that remains a major public health problem in sub-Saharan Africa. It's estimated that 3.2 million people are infected with schisto in Niger alone. Both urogenital, that's Schistosoma hematobium, and intestinal Schistosoma mansoni are endemic in Niger, but the main species is hematobium throughout the country. The control strategy used by the National Control Programme is school-based treatment with praziquantel, with treatment of high-risk adults, which are as per the WHO guidelines. There is a growing body of evidence, however, regarding the burden of adults and preschool children in their potential burden in sustaining transmission, which suggests a need for them to be included in treatment programs. There is also a debate around the optimal frequency of treatment for infection and morbidity control, where some studies have shown that more frequent treatment, such as biannual MDA, has a greater impact on parasite control. Next slide. So in light of this controversy around the optimal approach of drug-based control, the Schistosomiasis Consortium for Operational Research and Evaluation, SCORE, was established in 2008 to address this, and SCORE's portfolio was a multi-country study, of which Niger was one of them. This is a study designed for Niger. So there were 6 possible combinations of annual and biannual community-wide treatment, or school-based treatment, and treatment holidays, so years where they were tested and referred for treatment. The primary outcome of interest for this study was the prevalence and intensity among 9 to 12-year-old children following 4 years of intervention. So in each of the 225 communities that were surveyed, 100 children aged 9 to 12 years are sampled each year. In addition to this, the impact of treatment on first-year students, which aged 5 to 8 years in their first year of school, and 50 adults aged 20 to 55 years were tested in the first and final year of the study. Next slide. So Arm A1 received rounds of school-based treatment in years 1, 3, and 4. Arm A2 received 1 round of school-based treatment in year 1, and then 2 rounds of school-based treatment in year 3 and 4. So Group A were all selected in moderate endemic areas. Next slide. Group B, B1 had annual school-based treatment, and B2 had biannual school-based treatment in year 3 and 4. And these are all conducted in high endemic areas. Next slide. And then Group C, this is Group C1 is annual community-wide treatment, and C2 is biannual community-wide treatment in year 3 and 4. So next slide. So these are where the villages were located along the Niger River Valley. Next slide. So the sample characteristics. So data was collected each year from October to February from 2011, which was the baseline year, to 2015, across 9 districts in Niger. As you can see, the prevalence of infection decreased from baseline to year 5 across all age groups. And there was a similar baseline prevalence of infection among first-year students, school-age children, and the adults. And prevalence of heavy infection also decreased over time. Next slide. So specifically, the primary outcome of this was to look at 9 to 12-year-olds, as this was the one age group that was sampled consistently across the years. Next slide. As expected, the relative reduction of prevalence is greater in twice-yearly treatment, which is what we expected, because if you're treating twice a year, you'd expect expect maybe a greater impact on the parasites. So this is A2, B2, C2, these are the biannual arms, compared with the annual MDA across study arms. The biggest difference is seen, however, in the arms starting with a higher prevalence, which is B2 and C2. A2 was a moderate prevalence, starting prevalence. Next slide. The egg reduction rate follows the same pattern as prevalence, again with there's a decrease in prevalence and intensity of infection across the study arms. Group B again shows the largest difference between treatment strategies. This is the high prevalence group. Next slide. The change in overall prevalence over time from baseline to year 5 by treatment group was only significant in arm B. This is the group again with the highest starting prevalence. So here we see the biggest impact. Next slide. In all arms, there was a decrease in prevalence over time. In group B and C, however, there was a peak in prevalence in year 3 as there was severe flooding in 2013 in Niger. And here we can see a peak in how really, environmental conditions such as that can really make a very big difference in control programs and peaks in infection. Next slide. Prevalence by gender also showed a higher prevalence among boys, which I think has been quite widely documented in Schisto, than girls, but this is significant only in group B. Response to treatment, however, was similar by gender, with both males and females showing reduction of prevalence over time. Next slide. So first year students, as I said at the beginning, 100 first year students were selected from each of the 225 communities, but only in baseline and year 5. So only the 9 to 12-year-olds are sampled each year. Next slide. So in years 1 to, the prevalence and intensity reduced across all the arms from baseline to year 5. Again, this decrease is more notable in arms B and C. Next slide. Again, data was also collected among adults aged 20 to 45. 50 adults were selected from each of the 225 communities in year 1 and 2. Next slide. Similarly, their prevalence and intensity reduced over time among adults. But what I wanted to highlight here was a reduction in adult prevalence that was statistically significant in arms B1 and B2, where only school-based treatment was given, which suggests that school-based treatment alone has an impact on disease transmission on the wider community. And this is actually a finding that we didn't really expect to find from this study. Next slide. So the take-home messages, there was no statistically significant difference between arms with once and twice year treatment, either community or school-based, in areas of low endemicity. We did see a significant impact where we started off with moderate to high infection. There was a prevalence decrease among adults in school-based treatment, implying that the rate of transmission in the whole community has been reduced, even if we just treat school-aged children. Next slide. So where does this fit in with this, this session today? So if we look at the 2020 WHO goal, the aim was for morbidity control of less than 5% of heavy infection in school-aged children. The proposed 2030 WHO goal is elimination as a public health problem and less than 1% prevalence of heavy intensity of infections. How did this research move us towards this new roadmap? Well, we did see in this study at least that heavy infections were less than 1% across all arms, regardless of annual or biannual community or school-based treatment by year 5 of the study. So how can this research be used by implementers to strengthen health systems? I think the prevalence and intensity of infection across all age groups remains poorly researched, and there's still a sparsity of data among adults specifically, and understanding what their risk of infection is for schistosomiasis. So what further research is required to achieve the shared goal? One would be expanding that full age profile when we're doing monitoring and evaluation, but also stopping treatment after achieving this elimination as a public health problem will likely lead to resurgence of infection, and elimination of transmission really remains to be defined for schistosomiasis. Also, the levels of systematic non-adherence to treatment remains unknown. So we know in this study, we had more than 75% treatment coverage across all 225 communities. But what we really don't know is whether it's the same people that are turning up to treatment, or whether we're getting pockets of those people who opt out of MDAs and general health programs that are maintaining transmission in those communities, which is why we get these hotspots. So how can research and programming better support one another? I guess it's important, and we've just done a systematic review on STH and Schisto in Ethiopia, where we find there's just such heterogeneity between methods used between different studies, and a lack of standardization. So that understanding of complying with WHO and governmental regulations in governing research is really important. Data management and transparency throughout research, and providing open access to research data is really key. And then finally, communication, being transparent among the research community, but also with policymakers is key. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna, very much indeed. Now we're going to move on now to Bonnie Webster from the National Natural History Museum, who's going to talk to us again about schistosomiasis, but focusing more on what novel tools or new tools are available to help in monitoring, evaluation and diagnosis. Bonnie, open to you.
Great, thank you, Roy. So yes, as Roy said, I'm going to follow on schistosomiasis, focusing on two areas, human diagnostics, and also looking at the snails themselves and called xenomonitoring. Next slide. So I won't go over the kind of knowledge about schistosomiasis, but here I just want to point out that the life cycle of schistosomiasis is very complex. And it's really this life cycle that makes it such a successful disease. And we also need to be aware of this in terms of thinking about elimination and keeping elimination, and also resurgence. And as we know, MDA is the main form of control, but we really need to implement multiple interventions to actually reach elimination. Next slide, please. So I've just pulled out here the goals from the roadmap, the WHO Road Map here, and schistosomiasis target for elimination. This is classified within that as less than 1% of the population with heavy intensity infections, and by 2030 it's up to 100% of endemic countries to reach elimination. But you can see that there are severe gaps in our diagnostics. You can see at the bottom there that we have diagnostics, but they require major modifications, and specific criterion there is to develop point of care diagnostics and also xenomonitoring tools for surveillance of transmission. Next slide. So for human diagnostics, we know that throughout a control program that our diagnostic need changes quite severely, particularly as we move to elimination settings. And we know that at that stage, we need very sensitive and specific diagnostics that can also be implemented at the point of need. And that's quite a big ask in multiple diseases. Next slide. And also think of schistosomiasis, I like to think of it as two diseases. They're quite different in terms of the morbidity that they show. We have intestinal schistosomiasis and also urogenital. They're caused by different species, and the samples that you use for carrying out your diagnostics are also very different. So sometimes it's very hard to come up with a diagnostic that fits both these forms of the disease as well. Next slide. So, and if you could just click again on that. So as I said, as we move towards elimination, our diagnostic needs to be sensitive specific. And we start to lose a lot of the pathology markers within our samples. So this is looking at urogenital myces here. And the urines that we get become very clear and they don't look like they have any pathology associated with them. And then people also seem to start to feel they don't seem to have any, they don't have infections related to it. So they actually get MDA fatigue and they're starting to not want to take treatment. Next, if you'd like to click on. And then thinking about resurgence, so back to that life cycle, if you can click on again, you can see that within those snails, even a single muricidia is able to replicate itself thousands of times. And this allows it to multiply itself and then lead to reinfections very, very rapidly. Next slide. So we have diagnostics which are available. There's the antigen tests which have been around for a long time. The POC-CCA from Mansoni is a very well used diagnostic. There are problems for that diagnostic now in terms of cross-reactivity. And then coming forward is the CAA test, which is for multiple species there and has great promise, but it's not ready as a point of care diagnostics yet. Next slide. And we also have molecular tests, particularly the isothermal tests here. I've pointed out LAMP and RPA here. These are very sensitive and specific tests, which can also, particularly for the isothermals, be implemented in the endemic setting. Next slide. And so I've been very lucky to work with Steffi Knopp and David, who have been working on the Zanzibar elimination study for hematobium. And there's been many years of control in Zanzibar, and they've reached very, very low levels of infection there and reached almost elimination prevalences. And that's through multiple interventions, MDA, snail control, and behavioural change. But using the diagnostics in Zanzibar, you can see there's big discrepancies. Next slide, please. And you can see that when they get down to very low egg counts, diagnostics become very inaccurate. And when you're down to the low levels of 1 to 4 eggs in samples, you get about 71% inaccuracies there. So we need much better diagnostics within these elimination settings. Next slide. This also shows up with using the newer diagnostics, such as CAA here, when you get big discrepancies between readings for CAA versus egg microscopy. And now we start to question about what the prevalence is in these settings, such as Zanzibar, where we think we're reaching elimination. Next slide, please. And we really, okay, that's fine. So we've been working on a isothermal, you can move forward, that's fine. Isothermal assay known as RPA. And this is a point of care assay which we've been developing, particularly for the use in Zanzibar. It's showing great promise, allowing us to move molecular diagnostics forward into the field. Next slide. And this just shows you some of the sensitivities that we're getting with that reading. As with egg microscopy, at very high egg counts, it's 100% sensitive, but as we get to low levels of egg counts again, it starts to reduce in sensitivity, but it's still a very promising diagnostic, which could provide on-the-ground point of care molecular diagnostics. But just to point out again, it's very hard to integrate diagnostics for multiple diseases, particularly in the endemic settings. And I know there's a lot of push to integrate diagnostics, but sometimes a more targeted approach to specific diseases and settings may be needed. And this is why we need to strengthen the connection between research and programming on the ground. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to quickly, the last few minutes, talk about xenomonitoring. And this is a very useful tool that allows us to track transmission. It'll be a very useful tool for certifying transmission interruption when we do get to that stage. But it allows us to do risk mapping of transmission sites, understand the snails involved in transmission. And it also allows to implement targeted snail control, which is also needed. So we don't need to do blanket wide approaches as well. Next slide. But I'd just like to point out how complicated this is, because there's multiple species of schistosomes circulating in the environments. Here is a phylogenetic tree showing the species of schistosomes, ones, that are not greyed out are the ones we find in Africa. So there's multiple species. And the only way to identify what's coming out of the snails and being transmitted is through molecular tests to actually identify the cercariae. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this takes a lot of work, and it also needs the knowledge of the transmission areas. There's multiple environmental conditions that we need to survey, and this varies by species and also by each endemic country. Next slide. And you need to collect, next slide please, you need to collect many, many snails. And so this is a study that shows a study from Mwanza. And through these surveys, we collect thousands of snails, and then we need to screen them for infections. And infection levels are routinely very, very low, even in very high prevalence settings. So this is a study from Mwanza. And the next slide, please. Thank you. This really shows that even in when you collect thousands of snails, you get very, very low levels of infection there. But those infections are not always what you assume them to be. So usually if you're doing a human prevalence study, you would expect, when you survey your snails, you're expecting to find human species. But this really shows you the diversity of what you can find. We had rodent, the Rhodani parasite in rodents in our Biophilaria snails. And also we found a new occurrence of this very new parasite, schistosome species, Kismuensis, found in Belina snails. And this has never been found in this area before, so it's very unexpected, but it really shows that not all your snails are shedding what you expect them to be infected with. Next slide. And this is another study that we're conducting in a urogenital transmission site, and this is the same study sites that Anna has just talked about. And again, we were surveying snails, collecting thousands of snails over multiple years. And we found only 116 infected. Next slide. But they were infected with very different species. And you can see here the predominant species infecting these snails is Schistosoma bovis, the cattle parasite. And then we have the human parasites, Haematobin, and what we also know about these Haematobin bovis snails only being transmitted in a small number of snails up in the northern sites of the Niger River. Next slide. And we also need to think about improving the sensitivity of these diagnostic assays. This is all about looking at infections within the snail by sampling the snail tissue. And this allows us to also detect immature infections and also infections that might not be compatible. And this increases the sensitivity of our genome monitoring methods. Next slide. And we need to work out some advanced methods for molecular detection systems within these snails and work out ways that we can pull lots of snails together, because it's a very labor-intensive methodology. And we need to improve those methodologies to actually be able to implement on the ground. Next slide. So in summary, so to strengthen and connect the connection between research and programming to beat NTDs, we know that we need to advance diagnostics, and these really need to be very highly sensitive, tailored to the specific settings that we're focusing on, and really should be able to support, test and treat and more targeted interventions, particularly as we meet elimination. Snail genome monitoring is highly sensitive and specific, but we need to do a lot of research to actually be able to tailor them to specific settings and to be able to implement them to those places needed. We also need to think about monitoring of other aspects of transmission, such as zoonotic reservoirs in Africa, such as we know that rodents and non-human primates are infected with some of these human pathogens, such as Mansoni, and they also need to be thought about within our transmission monitoring. But the take-home message really is there's significant research that's needed to advance these tools so they can actually be used within these programs and implemented on the ground. And I think the main limiting factor there is the funding that's available for this kind of research. And next slide, just my thank yous. Thank you to everybody that's involved in the studies, and thank you to the organisers.
Good, Bonnie, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure in the discussion we'll come back to diagnostics, etc. and sensitivity, and also how they influence achieving the WHO goals. Well, we're now going to do the complicated bit, or we're not going to do it, MIT is going to do it, which is split us up into groups, and 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, where you will have a moderator to help the discussions going. Now, timing wise, we're running slightly behind. So we have, if we're going to allow, say, 7.5 minutes for final discussion, we have roughly 25 to 27 minutes for the breakout groups. So can I hand over to Claire and Justine to split us up into these discussion groups? Raise. So room 1, is that you, Carolyn? Yeah. Can't hear you. Muted.
Really?
On your phone.
That's
Can you
it.
hear me now? Hello?
Yes, you need to shout.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. Well, that's weird. Okay. So the main point that we had was collecting data, because, well, evidence is based on data, right? And we had a great example of integrating data collection, but also
Les gens qui sont passés pour les travaux dehors là.
sorry?
I think we've got a cross line. Carry on.
Okay, good. But also to also integrate data collection, but also integrate education and training programs across different diseases. So it would also be the most resource-saving way, and it would be very efficient. And you can see patterns that you don't see if you only look at the data set for one disease. But
you're breaking up.
another thing is that data collection needs to be data collection.
I'm not getting a sound. Does anybody else?
No, Carolyn, we
Carolyn,
can't.
it's broken. Carolyn, it's breaking up. Right. I think what we'll do here. Can you hear us now, Carolyn? We can't hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Sorry, my connection must be bad now. So
yeah. Just be very brief because we've got the 10 minutes. So those are two very good points. Integration for data collection. Carry on quickly.
Okay, so then if you have collected your data in a systematic and integrated way, you might also be able to see patterns that you would not see if you only collect your data separately, right?
Yeah, okay, wonderful, thank you. Now, room 2, Anna.
Yeah, so we talked about the importance of empowering communities and creating that demand for treatment, but also educating people about symptoms of the diseases so they know what they're looking for and when they need to be seeking help. The importance of strengthening health professionals in diagnostics and case definitions, research on diagnostics and the importance of that, particularly as we move towards elimination for certain diseases. For example, schistosomiasis, which becomes increasingly difficult to diagnose and treat, and using more sensitive diagnostics. And that links obviously into a donor perspective and how much funding is available for that. And then I guess we talked about the building blocks of health system strengthening, which includes governance and supporting the ministries of health and leading annual work planning to develop those health strengthening goals, financing, so that would obviously be understanding the costs of all these different approaches and working out what's more cost effective and using research to feed back into that, into control programs, for example, what I touched on in the share study showing that, you know, the impact of community-wide treatment versus school-based treatment, and what the financial implications of that are, and resource mobilization. The development of guidelines for diagnostics and case definitions within the country, and supporting them to do that. And then health information systems. We didn't really talk about it, but just having a mechanism to record cases that are presenting in more rural areas, so that they're able to.
You've muted
myself. And track and tracing infections that are appearing in more rural areas. And then I guess finally would be more service delivery, and using existing platforms to achieve that.
Good.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you, Anna. Now, who's going to do room 3? Justine.
I think, yeah. So Bonnie was leading and I was taking some notes, and we were talking about identifying research needs to achieve the WHO Road Map targets, and sort of what's required there. We heard first from some practitioners about research needs around leprosy diagnostics, around treatment reaction and drug resistance. We also picked up on the point that Anna made in her presentation about standardizing the research that we do, so that the results that we get are comparable. And we talked about needing guidance from WHO and others on what strategies to use on survey design and on the cost effectiveness of different study designs. So that standardization is great, but some guidance will be needed there. We talked a little bit as well about what kind of research we need to be able to show how to integrate NTDs into public health, into primary healthcare systems and universal healthcare, and what we could perhaps do to share learnings between different disease groups to synthesize and provide more location-specific information that works across diseases rather than being siloed in diseases. And then we heard from people in countries in Nigeria and in Ghana about getting policy change, so that once a change in practices in policy, then you can put pressure on the ministries of health for policy implementation. And we heard about an example where NTDs were included in district scorecards, so that when those districts were doing performance reviews, NTDs were included in that, and it increased interest in NTDs and was associated with better funding. I think,
Lovely.
Bonnie, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've covered very well. Thank you, Justine.
Lovely, thank you. Good, well, thank you all very much. Just let's try and draw together any themes here. We're all learning about this medium, as it were, for having conferences, and we've got to learn how to use it as effectively as possible in the coming 6 months before vaccines become available. 3 central things, I think, there. First of all, we'd like WHO and the countries, in some senses, to collaborate to define what research advances would help them most in these NTD areas in accelerating at this end phase. Is it a new diagnostic for leprosy? Is it an early antibody or antigen test for visceral leishmaniasis? Is it the use of one of Bonnie's diagnostic tools for schistosomes? What would make the most difference in terms of advancing the agenda? And one would like WHO, not the research community, to lead this. We want the practitioners to lead this. That is WHO and the Ministries of Health. So that's the first point. In some senses, if you had that definition, you could then set up the grand challenges, as it were, which is linked to Gates and other organizations, where you give incentives for people to solve those questions. The second theme I got from it was integration, which Carolyn started off with, that often in M&E surveillance, we do everything separately. You know, whether it's malaria, STH or SCH, we do it as separate programs. But so many of these could be done by common M&E programs of data collation across a whole variety of infections, whether it's protozoan, bacterial or helminth. Then the last thing that's very much in my mind at the moment, but it's very related to essentially what is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. As the NTD control has been more and more successful and the prevalences get lower and lower, the health economic arguments for spending a lot of money on these become less compelling. And so as we move to these low prevalence settings, if you add a modern diagnostic, which is costly, is this a cost-effective way for a country to spend its healthcare budget? Now, the answer relates to the timescale over which you look at health economics. If you look at over a government cycle of funding, which 3 to 5 years, then essentially it may not be. But if you look at elimination over a much longer timescale, where you reduce the need for both M&E and indeed treatment, then it becomes more and more pertinent. So we have an educational problem to do, which is essentially persuading people that even at these low prevalences, which the community has got and the countries have got their NTDs to, it's going to be even more challenging in the coming 5 years to maintain attention and to make the arguments about why we should continue to reach the morbidity control and transmission targets. So those are the 3 major points I got out. I'm sure I've missed 101 others. Now, just to quickly, I really want to thank our 4 speakers. You, on average, were precisely on time, and you linked the subject of research to programmatic needs superbly well, all 4 of you. And then lastly, if I could thank Justine, who put all this together. So Justine, thank you very much indeed, and bullied everybody into getting their slides done on time. And then also to thank our electronic organizers, which is Claire at MYT, for actually doing the difficult bit, which is throwing us into 3 different rooms and then bringing us back on time. But thank you all to the participants and the people who kindly joined. Thank you very much indeed. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.